Well, I'd like to begin by saying briefly who I am, and then we'll get on with the main content of what I have to say. So my name is Andrew Steane. I'm a physics professor at Oxford University in England, and I'm speaking today also in my capacity as a member of the Christian community generally and a member of my local church. So the talk I'm about to give is, if it has a title, the title might be Science and Humanity. It's very much to do with a book I've written with that title. And my aim now is to summarise in approximately first a section about 20 minutes on the nature of science, how science is structured and therefore how it describes the natural world and what sort of a physical world it suggests we're part of. But I'd also like to turn to what is the sort of theme of the second half of the book, so that'll be another 15 minutes or so, concerned with trying to help people understand what sort of language we're speaking when we try to talk to one another in terms of, theology and what it means to speak of God. That's a thing where we have to tread carefully, so I'll come to that in the second half of my talk. So to repeat then, that the first half is very much about the nature of science and also about the nature of other sorts of human activities that we all find valuable. For example, literature, history, philosophy, politics, economics, art, poetry, and one can go on. And my aim is partly to show how science sort of fits with and engages with these other areas of human life. And what science is in and of itself. And so this part of my talk is really free to anyone to take in from whatever their religious commitment or lack of, or commitment to not have religious commitment. It's aimed to be broad, to just be as clear as I can be about how science really operates, what sort of a thing it is, and therefore why I'm so positive about it, why I think it's a very valuable and creative sort of partner that we have as we try to understand our own nature and how to create a better future. Of course, it's also a very powerful tool, and that means it also has risk attached to it, as does any powerful tool, so it can be misused and abused. And one of the ways in which science is, I think, currently being misused and abused by some, and this is sort of an idea making its way out into popular culture, it's the idea that science somehow offers us the be-all and end-all language and terms of discourse that just will ultimately describe everything in such a way that other areas of human sort of engagement, areas I referred to earlier when I talked about poetry and history, somehow science will ultimately replace all these. This idea is wrong, and I want to show why it's wrong and why it matters. So the truth of it, I think, is that we need all of these different languages and ways of speaking and addressing what is the nature of our life and our existence together. But the reason why it's sometimes hinted that somehow science can eventually replace all these other areas, it comes from the idea that because science tends to mostly speak in terms of the mechanism of things, it tends to mostly take an interest in the bits and pieces which make up stuff. Like in biology, we look into the details of the cell and the nucleus and the molecules which make the cell, and we come to a picture of a living cell as somewhat like a factory or a machine. And there's a lot of truth in that picture, but I say a lot of rather than that's the whole truth. And I'll have to try and unpack what I mean by that as I go along. So let me then do this firstly by using an image which I introduce in my book, and I think is a helpful one to be thinking of. It's the image of a bridge which is made of stone, and I have in mind an arched bridge, so you can imagine the stones one above another forming an arch, and overall you've got the bridge shape and some sort of walkway over the top. So if we want to understand a bridge, it would be natural then to look into the way it's constructed, and we would think about the stones that make the bridge, and we can examine them, and maybe they're limestone or marble or some other material. There might be mortar between the stones, And by the time we've looked at all the stones and mortar, we will find that we have in fact looked at every part of the stuff which makes a bridge. So we might begin to feel then that once I've understood a single stone, and once I've understood how one stone connects to another, well, that's it. There is nothing else to say. I've now got a complete understanding of a bridge. And interestingly, that conclusion is wrong. And the reason it's wrong is because you could equally well have a bridge made out of some other stuff. You could make a bridge out of wood or steel. And if you think that by understanding stones, you've somehow completely understood a bridge, but you fail to see that in fact that same bridge or that same geometric shape could in principle be brought about using other materials, then you fail to see one of the important aspects of what a bridge is. A bridge is also, as well as if it's stone being made of stones, it's also a certain shape which distributes force in a certain way owing to its global geometry. And in order to see that, you need to sort of perceive the bridge as a whole and how it's working together as a whole. And that language of how the bridge works as a whole does not need to even adopt the language of stones. After all, the bridge might be made of wood. So this is just an example of the way in which one way of speaking, one set of insights, and the insights that are offered here through stones and mortar are genuinely insights. They do tell us about the bridge, but they don't tell us the whole story. And the other way of seeing what a bridge is, when we talk about its global properties, that doesn't replace or negate the picture from the stones, but importantly for this talk, nor does the language of the stones replace or negate the global perspective of the bridge as a whole. So that is the image which will repeatedly inform what I have to say. So where I'd like to go next is to bring to our imagination another sort of structure, which is a tower. And what I want to do now is explain that a certain picture of science and what science is has sort of entered into the popular imagination. But as any good, well-trained philosopher of science would say, and indeed as many scientists will tell you, it's in fact an incorrect picture. So this is the picture of science as a sort of tower of explanation. So in this tower image, you have physics at the bottom providing the description of the bits and pieces of the natural world. And then the notion is that somehow physics explains chemistry. So chemistry sort of sits above. Chemistry somehow follows from physics. And then chemistry in turn describes biology. So, implicitly then, once you've understood physics, you sort of got chemistry for free and biology comes along and it's sort of a tower. Plausible as that might seem at first sight, it is wrong. And let me try to unpack why it's wrong. Before I do that, let me say that a better image of how these disciplines relate to one another is the image of a network. So it's more like that there's two-way communication between physics and chemistry, physics and biology, biology and chemistry. I use these three names as sort of stand-ins for major parts of science. Of course, you can't separate scientific disciplines completely. They're not completely compartmentalized. But nevertheless, it's helpful to have the terminology. So the point is that physics does indeed have a lot to say to chemistry. It provides an understanding of the quantum physical principles which underlie what goes on in chemical reactions. But in fact, in order to understand networks of chemical reactions, it's not unusual to find that to get a good insight into a complex set of chemical interactions, you don't particularly need to know much about the quantum physics that underlies each individual example interaction. What you need to understand is the nature of the network, the way it's connected up. And that's just another illustration really of why, like my bridge and stones, you have to sort of learn a different language sometimes in order to have insight into chemistry. Another example of this would be the way we happily give the Nobel Prize each year in a subject such as biology to people whose understanding of quantum physics might be close to zero. I mean, these are very intelligent people and they've studied biology at great depth, but they've chosen not to get the training which is required to understand the sort of things which the quantum physicists are studying. And why not? Because it's not needed. You can have great insight into biology without knowing much about what is a quantum wave function. You can have some general knowledge of it, but you will not need the expertise or the knowledge of the details. And this is because scientific explanation is structured a certain way. And it's because, by implication, the natural world is also structured a certain way, in which there are discourses and insights to be had in lots of different areas, and no one discourse and insight replaces all the others. So to give you a terminology to speak about this, I think the word support is a good one, and then the word enarch. Enarch is a term that I've just sort of coined for this purpose. My idea would be that you could say of physics that physics supports biology. It provides an understanding of material structures that can be used to enable biological organisms to have existence. But it does that without telling you exactly what is the nature of those organisms. For that, you need another discourse, and it's the discourse which biologists slowly but surely arrive at. And that language, I put it to you, enarches over physics. It's a bit like the arch. It sort of gives a global insight into stuff at one level, which is not replacing, nor is replaced by the insights that go on at the other level. Now, I'll give an example of this also within my own discipline, which is fundamental physics. So the point being, I've talked about physics and biology just now, but this very same idea is already at work in the fundamentals of physics itself. When we think about quantum physics and the way individual particles relate to one another, we can come at this and try to understand it using two different types of reasoning. And these two different types of reasoning both are useful. So one type is the one where we try to write equations which describe the dynamics of one thing, what happens following on from what goes on just before. Famously, we have Newton's laws, which do that for a large variety of processes where a force acts and there is an acceleration in response to the force. So we have the things that we call equations of motion. But interestingly, we also have another aspect of how we do physics, and it's earned the name symmetry principle. So what we do now with the symmetry principle is we ask questions such as, of a given set of phenomena, would the things that are going on there still be the same after some sort of change had taken place? The change might be a reflection, for example, a mirror reflection. So that's why the word symmetry is used. But you could also imagine a change which just means all of the things that you're thinking about have moved from one place to another. That would be called a translation. So we end up with the name translational symmetry. So translational symmetry, to illustrate, is used when we understand the workings of many ordinary things. I like to use the example of a car. So a car has a motor, and the motor will work no matter which city you happen to be driving around. You can drive around London, you could drive around Paris. There's no reason why the car which is designed to work in London won't also work in Paris. So that's an example of this idea of a symmetry. You can just move the thing from one place to another and it'll still behave the same way. And it turns out this idea of a symmetry or a symmetry principle gives us a lot of insight into the nature of what's going on. That particular example, for example, the symmetry called translational symmetry, applies to the workings of a car motor, which is broadly speaking well captured by principles of physics that would be known to people hundreds of years ago. It's what we now call classical physics. But it also applies to quantum physics. So what I mean by that is that the notion of symmetry, the symmetry principle, is valuable to understand things like motors. It's also valuable to understand things like the interior dynamics of a molecule. So this symmetry idea is bringing with it a very valuable insight, and it gives us a huge amount of insight into physics. It has been said of physics in the past 50 years that much of the progress in fundamental physics could be argued to be a process of reasoning from symmetry in deeper and deeper ways. So let me say a little bit more about, let me expand on this example of the car. Someone looking at the motor of a car might just say, well, hang on a minute, I've learned about how cars work. The fuel is burned, the expanding hot gas pushes the piston back in the cylinder. That's connected in due course to the crankshaft and ultimately to the wheels. So I never needed to mention the symmetry principle. So surely they might say, I have no need of that hypothesis. But what's interesting is that the very principles that discussion used, the laws that describe the way a force results in an acceleration, that very idea can itself be derived from a symmetry principle. Or to get that equation right, you can start with a symmetry as your starting point. So far from sort of failing to be useful, the symmetry principle here provides the very terms of discussion. And that is how it often works out in physics. So I don't have time to go into all the examples that one could easily draw on. In my book, of course, I take time to look at more examples. But the point I think for today's talk is that this business of science not having the structure of a tower, but rather having the structure of a network of insights which inform one another without either end completely replacing the other. That's what scientific explanation is like. And it's already like that even within physics. So for sure it's like that as you move between physics and other areas. Okay, so in the next part of my talk I will offer some thoughts on another area of science where I no longer speak from the same expertise which I bring to physics, but I think I'm reasonably well informed. And this is on evolutionary biology. So I have a sort of mainly a twofold message. The first part is to say that I think evolutionary biology, as it is described in the mainstream scientific account here, is a very insightful and important set of ideas. I think it gives great insight into the development of life on Earth and indeed into the development of the human species in particular. And also it gives insight into how living things are right now in the present. But I also think that while retaining the actual the scientific account and the facts on which it is based and not rejecting them, nevertheless we can try to offer to one another a more insightful overall view of what it's really amounting to, or what it's really telling us about the story of life on Earth. And here I want to push back against some other sort of versions of this that have entered into popular culture. So one of the things that has been much emphasized in evolutionary biology is the role of chance. And chance is a tricky sort of idea, because another word for chance is openness. We use the word chance when we mean that what happens next is not completely determined by what went just before. So there's more than one possibility of what comes next. However, if you use the word chance, you tend to bring to that a slightly negative connotation, as if it's sort of meaningless and random. But if you bring the word openness, you tend to bring to it a slightly more positive connotation, as if, oh, that's interesting, there's opportunity there. And I don't want to completely say one or other of these adjectives is the right one, but there is certainly a lot to be thought about concerning the notion that there's an openness and an opportunity in the way that evolution has proceeded. But I think more importantly, what I want to add to this is that it's not altogether true, as has been widely suggested, that there's no sense in which evolution could be said to be guided. But the guidance is of a subtle kind. I'll give the example of the shape of trees. So if you look at any ordinary tree trunk, and we've all seen these after a tree has been chopped down, you look at the cross section, you see that it's not exactly circular, but it's roughly circular. You don't see many triangular trees or highly elliptical shapes. And of course that same roughly circular cross section can be found in lots of other biological things, in the shape of bones of mammals, the shape of the antenna on an insect. You often see roughly cylindrical shapes. So, given that there is this role of randomness or openness in evolution, is this then just a coincidence that we see roughly circular shapes so many times? And of course it's not a coincidence at all. The roughly circular shape is there because that shape has certain global properties which make it a productive shape, one which is efficient in its use of materials. And my point now is that fact about the relative efficiency of a roughly circular cylinder as compared to a triangular one, that fact is not random. That's simply a fact that emerges from mathematics and engineering. And evolutionary biology could not fail to discover it. It sits there as a sort of a mould or a thing to be discovered, which a process like evolutionary biology will fill out and fill as it explores all the different ways of being that there are, that there are ways of being alive. It finds itself realising these simple facts in this example about maths and engineering. And these facts are not random. And I extend this further to more subtle things, like the rules that describe social relations in a species that is able to have social relations. So social relations require a certain sophistication, of course, in the sort of mental apparatus. But we see them at work in mammals such as elephants, or indeed in the pod of whales, or of course in the great apes and monkeys. And interestingly there you see some commonalities. There's a sense in which it's not possible to form a social group unless members of the group have basic abilities, like the ability to recognise each other, to recognise that they are indeed part of the group. They require also a certain amount of willingness to suspend hostilities a little bit. There needs to be a little bit of trust going on in order that social relations can work. And this we see both in human life. We see both the presence and absence of trust, and how the one is so creative and the other so destructive. But my point is that evolutionary biology could not fail to discover this, because it's simply a fact about how social relations work. And so my aim here is to show that the whole glorious history of life on Earth has not been just a random lurching from one meaningless place to another. It has been a beautifully creative discovery of more and more deep and meaningful ways in which things can be alive and relate to one another. And interestingly, nor is it a story primarily of predation and parasitism, although those do feature, and they are, of course, difficult and cause us much pause for reflection. But nevertheless, it is also a story of longer and longer care and concern as higher mammals invest more and more effort in their own offspring and indeed in the social dynamics of their group. So these things are also going on in the mainstream picture of life on Earth, but we need to have a willingness to describe it in full and to see it as it truly is. So I'm now going to move in my talk to what I called at the beginning the second half. So it's a slightly more theological in style, and even the very word theology, I know that some of my listeners will feel somewhat uneasy with that very word, but I'll try to speak helpfully if I can. I think my main aim here is to address the boundary between what might be called modern day atheism and modern day theism. And I just want to encourage people who see themselves as on one side or other of that boundary, just to be a bit more willing to listen to one another. My point is, for example, well, one thing that can easily be said is that quite a lot of what a modern day atheist might want to say as to things that they find unhelpful and simply untrue. Well, I'm coming from a Christian perspective here, and I'd say, yeah, those things are unhelpful and untrue. We agree on that. An example might be using the name God for a sort of being which sits somewhere outside the universe and is somewhat like a sort of super powerful human or something. I just want to say, yeah, that image hasn't really sat well with Christian thinkers ever since the beginning. In fact, if you go back into ancient Israel, 1,000 years before the time we now call the Common Era, the ancient Hebrews were also very uneasy with that idea of a sort of a super being. They had a word for that way of thinking about God. They had the word Baal or Baal or however it's pronounced. And what they were doing there is they were trying to say, yeah, we know that even we are drawn to that way of thinking, but we need to push that away, because what we really need to talk about is the reality that underpins where we really come from and what we might really aspire to, which is a reality that we're trying to discover, whose name, in other words, whose character, is not altogether known to us, nor is it available to us, to know that name or that character merely by intellectual pursuits. It's a bit more challenging than that. It goes also to how we behave. It calls upon all our powers of being as a human. And so the difficulty which we have in speaking about this now in modern English is that somehow the English language has failed to develop different words for these two different things, these two different concepts. So, we have the single word God, and sometimes it's held to be the sort of God you see in the, in a science fiction comic, a sort of super being. And then, on the other hand, a lot of people are using that same word to try to get at the richness and the depth of the reality that in fact gave rise to us. That is in fact the truth of where we come from and of what we might appropriately and correctly aspire to be more like as we live together in community. So a lot of people are using the word God for that. Well, goodness, we're just going to confuse one another if we don't try and listen a bit more carefully. So one of the things I want to do now is say that this is why careful speech about God, the bigger picture now, is never easy and often is indirect. It's often better done by means of parables and poems. It's not that the analytical talk can't come along as well, but the analysis can never do the whole work. We need other ways of communication. And analysis on its own tends to sort of dry up and be unconvincing. And I want to show you why this is. And I can do it with an illustration from relations that we are more familiar with in the way we talk to one another. It's the business of objectifying a human being. So if one person tries to, whether deliberately or unwittingly, objectifies another person, then the first person who's doing that really fails to engage with the other person as they really are. An example might be someone who goes about trying to form friendships through calculation. They might develop a calculation. They have a little checklist of desirable qualities in another person, and they sort of look around for the people who tick off the list, and they think, oh, good, right, I will be a friend to this other person. But what are they doing there? They're sort of, it's a bit too self-interested, isn't it? That's not quite how friendship works. We've got to be willing to be a little bit more risky and just personal and human about it, and just engage with one another without calculating too fully what it is we think we're going to gain from it or lose from it or whatever. We engage in the interaction. And people who refuse to do that, the more extreme case, of course, is when the objectification refuses to even see that another person is genuinely a person. And of course, this is at the root of all sorts of racial prejudice. It was at the root of some of the most terrible crimes of the 20th century. So it's easy to see that this is a bad way to approach interactions between human people. Well, if you think that you can engage with the truth about the reality that we all in fact come from and aspire to and can appropriately engage with, if you think you can come at that reality purely by analysis, you are, I'm afraid, making a similar mistake. So, for example, if you just describe some attributes of some sort of deity figure, and then think that after that you can have a list of reasons to believe in the or not, or counter evidence, or in favour or against the existence of this deity figure, then from the start you've not in fact engaged with what it is that the religious people are trying to talk about. You've engaged with something else. And it does indeed prove to be a bit empty, that something else. Just to throw in another example of this, in the play King Lear by Shakespeare, the whole play turns on an effort but at the start of the play by the king in his folly. He decides that he's going to sort of have a love competition, and he will ask his children to show by their words which of them loves him the most. And of course, the play is all about the fact that this is a self-undermining request. Those that love the king most dearly will find it hardest to try to win such a competition. And what does Cordelia do? Well, she finds that she just has to be silent. And of course, she's the one that truly loves him. So, and it's similar. Some of the questions which are asked about, proofs of God, they sometimes fall into that sort of way of thinking. They're self-undermining, and we can't really reply except with silence, or just attempts to come at it from another direction. And so Jesus spends a lot of time talking in parables. He's not trying to be elusive. He's just trying to get around the suspicions and reservations that we all have, and trying to sort of get us to a better way of thinking about things. So, I guess, as I say, I'm trying to invite a more open and listening type of dialogue between people who nowadays, count themselves in one place or another in this particular discussion. And among the people that I mentioned in my book, I refer to the poet R.S. Thomas. So he's been very helpful to me, and he's quite good at sort of capturing the tricky language which insightful language about theology has to adopt. So I'm now just going to turn to a quotation from him. So this is the last part of a poem called Emerging. We are beginning to see now matter is the scaffolding of spirit, that the poem emerges from morphemes and phonemes, that as form in sculpture is the prisoner of the hard rock, so in everyday life it is the plain facts and natural happenings that conceal God and reveal him to us little by little under the mind's tooling. So it's interesting there, it's the plain facts and natural happenings that conceal God in one respect, because we can just say, oh, it's just the natural happenings and leave it at that. But what we're doing when we find that those facts also reveal God to us is we're trying to see the whole of what things are saying in the natural world. So we're trying to get at really the meaning of things. And here's an example of the limitation of scientific analysis. Some people, want to say, oh, well, science in principle, can describe everything. And I know up to a point what they mean by that. But it's easy to find questions on which science really falls silent. And I'll give an example. The question, what is the most appropriate way for me to spend my time this afternoon? Science really can't tell me that. That's a question about value and what sort of behaviour on my part is more creative or more appropriate to the opportunities that I have. And to answer questions like that, we need a whole other level of discourse. And ultimately, what we're doing when we see the language of God as appropriate to describe what's going on it's because we're saying that ultimately there is a certain personal character to that which fully liberates us or enables us to be human in the most creative possible way. There's a certain personal element to it, which I don't pretend to be easy to describe. But it's why the language of God, rather than simply goodness, is good, appropriate language.